So I'm just going to jump right into this, try to make this as quick as possible. What we're doing here is making some wall frames, like living art, that you can put succulents in. The succulents don't take a lot of water, so you can actually hang them on the wall. You can get low light succulents that can go indoors, or they can do outdoors. So I decided to go with cedar, any kind of cedar, cypress. I wanted some sort of wood that was naturally anti-rot. So these cedar boards that we got were pretty rough. First thing I did, as you're seeing, I just ran them through the planer, got them nice and smooth, started with some smooth surface. Now you see here, there's like a 1/8 of an inch gap. So I wanted to, first of all, make a board wide enough for my back. So you've seen there, I marked up on one and down on the other. That way, my blade, I'll use a digital angle gauge, and it says that it's 90 degrees. But if your blade is off a fraction of a degree, and you're trying to joint two boards together, when you cut both of them on the same way up, and you flip it around, you double whatever your margin of error was. Well, if you flip one upside down when you cut it, then that gives it the opposite angle. So even if you're off a 1/2 degree, when you put the two boards together, the 1/2 degree is going to be opposite sides. So then the boards will joint together nice and smooth. So I just pushed them through, cut off the edge, and then I put my glue all the way down, and then I glued the two boards together. I wanted to do this first to give the boards time to dry while I was making the other part of the frame. So I went ahead and marked the time to make sure I had about an hour. Now I'm going to use Titebond 3, which is waterproof in case these are placed outside, and it sticks very well. So something I noticed about these boards, they weren't all the same width like you would normally get with dimensional lumber, but I went ahead and ripped them down all to the same width. And then I ripped them to 2 1/4 inches because that's a good size, I think, for the frame. So here you see I took the first part and I cut my 45. I've got my saw set up. I put a stop over there at 12 inches. And then I cut my 45. And then all I have to do is flip the board over and push it up there and cut the next 45. So I can sit here, and for the 12 by 12 frames, these 4 pieces are going to be exactly the same size. And the key to making a good tight miter joint is that you have to have all the pieces exactly the same size. The 2 tops have to be exactly the same size and the 2 bottoms. So I'm going to go ahead and put a stop every time, and that way I can make sure, because if they're 11 3/4 or 12 1/4, it doesn't matter as long as they all equal the same size. Now this is a technique that, I don't know, people probably don't like, but what I've done is I put that Titebond 3 on there. My angles are cut exactly at 45. I check them again with my digital angle finder and make sure I'm at a good 45. So this is a little pin nailer. Shoots a 23 gauge pin. So I put my glue up there, and I can take and hold my joint nice and tight, makes a perfect miter joint there. And then I shoot a couple of pins. These are the longest that the gun will shoot. I think they're 1 3/16. And so I can shoot up about 1 inch or so away from the corner and put a couple of pins either way. And that's going to hold that joint nice and tight until it dries. So then I flip over and do the other side, and the same thing is I'm trying to get a good, nice, tight miter joint. So once I get both sides with good, tight miter joints, I'll let that dry. I'm not going to rush it. I'm going to go ahead and set those to the side, an hour minimum. The longer the better, and let those get good and set up. So now that I've got my frames over there drying with the 3 sides glued together, I'm going to come back here to my 2 planks that I have glued together, trying to make one wide board. So these have been sitting here a little over an hour. They're hard enough, the glue's hard enough that we can now run it through the planer and get a nice, smooth, wide plank. So I decided I wanted to make the backs about 9 inches because it's going to have a board on either side of it. That's about 3/4 of an inch each. So that's going to make it about 10.5 inches. So it's going to give you about a 3/4 inch offset from the edge of the frame. You know, I've made some of these before, going right out to the edge of the frame, trying to go to the inside the frame. And I find, you know, if you just give yourself about 3/4 of an inch there, and it makes it a whole lot easier and it looks a whole lot nicer, you know. So, you know, my wife, she's filming, she likes the fact that I've got the dust collection there. You know, just flip the little switch and, you know, it keeps a lot of that dust out of the shop. So anyway, I run my board through that I had made up, you know, and I cut this down. I actually ran the one side, you know, and just cut off about a 1/4 inch there. And then I flipped it over and cut it down to size because my saw, I'm using actually a fine cut CMT blade because the cedar is so soft. You know, it's normally like a plywood blade, but I'm using it to cut this cedar and it's cutting it fine, and it's giving me a super fine edge on the edge of that wood. It's a lot better than what the factory edge is. So now that I have my board here cut down, then I go back over to my chop saw, set it up on a 90°, and I once again put a stop over there, and then I, you know, set the saw to cut the board square. So I'm going to cut that first board, and then I'll set it over here. And then I'm going to slide my plank forward, and then I'm going to cut the second one because I want all these to be the same, but I also want to be a square. So I'm going to rotate that board 90° and place it on top of the other board. And so if they line up perfectly, then you know it's square. If there's a little overhang when you rotate it, then you know it's not square and you need to reset your stop. So luckily I got it right the first time, and so now I know my stop is set correctly, and I can go ahead and cut all my backs real quick. So now I'm over here on my router, and I'm sitting here trying to set up some stops. So I've got a little keyhole bit in my router there, and if you've never used these little keyhole bits, they're actually a pretty cool little bit. But even with those, you know, sometimes for me, I got to figure out, okay, I need to plunge it in here, slide it over. This is going to make my groove so long. So you see me here, just kind of back and forth, and I'm going through the motions as how I would cut this and making sure before I get this router going that I'm going to do it right. So I had to set up the stop. You know, you push it through, and so the bit goes in, and then you slide it forward, and it makes that little round hole, and then you pull it back out, and you know, you're done. So once you get it set up, you know, you can go through here, and you know, it doesn't take but a second. And this is something you don't have to do. You can just put a little screw on the back of it. But I think it's a nice little touch, especially, you know, if you're trying to make something really nice. For me, one of the most important things is to make sure that the top of both of the slots are the same height, so when they hang them on the wall, they can put their screws level, and then the frame's going to sit. So now that we've got that all done on the backs, we're time to finish off the front face frames. So what I've done here is I put my clamp down and made sure that the sides are squeezed into the proper width. Sometimes whenever they glue up, for whatever reason, you know, it just doesn't want to come out perfect. So I can put that clamp there, tighten up just a little bit to get kind of a fine tuning, and dry fit my board, make sure it's going to fit in there perfect. Put my glue on it, do the same thing as before, shoot the pin nails in it to hold it in place. And if there's a tiny gap on one side, you know, so now we've got 3 of our miter joints that are, you know, basically perfect. And that 4th one, if there's any error anywheres in any of our angles, you can see right there that tip is just 32nds of an inch. It's enough that I took and tightened out my clamp just a hair, and that brought it in, and I was able to get that to be a super tight joint. So, went ahead and pinned that and put it to the side to dry. And once it's fully dry, we'll sand it. And if there is any gaps left, you take some of the sanding dust, mix it with a little glue, and it'll fill in. Luckily on this project, I didn't have to fill in any cracks, but the more you do it, the less you end up having to fill those in. But filling them in with a little bit of glue, you'll never really notice. So now that the face frames are all completed, they're just over there drying, it's time to finish the box portion. So I still had my stops on my saw set from where I was cutting the backs. So I want to cut 2 boards each that is the exact same length as what the back is. And the reason I'm only doing 2 each is the 2 sides, and I'm going to put those 2 on the top and the bottom. And the side is going to be double the thickness of this wood longer, and that way it'll cover up the joints on the top and bottom. And so when you're looking at it from the side, you just see one nice board. Now I could have cut this miter, and I've done these before and mitered them, but why go through the headache of trying to make another perfect miter joint? A butt joint will work just fine. This is just holding in a little bit of dirt. So I went ahead and, like with everything, I'm trying to figure out the best way to do this. I clamped in a little piece of scrap plywood on my table here, and because I wanted the edges all to be nice and smooth, and this didn't work out the best when I went to do the other side, so I ended up just move that out of my way and put a little glue on it. This is the inside of the box, so I didn't really care too much if the inside had glue. You see me wiping off the outside because the outside I want it to look nice, even though that's the back. So I ended up, I'm like, which way do I put this? And like I say, it wasn't that big of a deal. It wasn't super, nothing strenuous there. So I just ended up slid it to the board, throw some glue on it, threw some pin nails, and it all worked out perfect. Those glued up just fine. So instead of going ahead and cutting this board, I went ahead and nailed up and then took a measurement because we've planed down this wood, so it may be a 1/16 of an inch narrower. It doesn't matter as long as the measurement is correct. So when I run it through the planer, I'm just running it through trying to get it nice and smooth, and I didn't really care about the thickness. They start out about 3/4 of an inch, so maybe they ended up being 5/8. And that's why I just went ahead, made up, glued in the top and the bottom, got my measurement, and then came over here, moved my little stop I had, made a cut, and then I tested it and made sure that it's the size I want it to be. So you see here, I put it in there, and that worked out perfect. So now I know I can go ahead and cut the rest of my boards, and they'll all be perfect also. Since I'm using a stop, it's much better with something like this to use stops rather than trying to measure each board. So now then I just took my glue, put around the edge here, and took my pin nailer and went ahead and pin nailed the 2 sides on. And again, these pin nails are just to hold it in place until that glue dries. This Tough Bond 3, I have tried to take a joint apart that I've glued, and you'll end up ripping the fibers of the wood out before you'll get the glue to break on this stuff. It's just some fantastic glue. And so I know that this project is going to be as good as a solid piece of wood once it's all dried. So I just went ahead, lined it up, made sure that my corners were perfect, and shot a pin in on the one side on that corner, and then I can go check and make sure it didn't move on me, shoot the second corner in. And then if my sides for whatever reason weren't sitting flush up against the edge, I will get them tweaked out. You can move it just a little bit there and shoot the top corners, and that way everything comes out nice, perfectly smooth and square, because that's the big thing. As long as you're cutting everything square, then whenever you start gluing it up and nailing these things, they just fall into place. It's really worth it to take a few extra seconds sometimes and make sure your saw blade, so whenever I cut the backs out, that was a nice 90-degree cut. And so whenever I nailed on the tops and bottoms, that joint is 90 degrees. So now with the sideboards, they're all cut on 90. And so now I can just set them in place, pop those little pin nails in, and everything comes out perfect. And taking that few extra steps to make sure your blades are nice and straight and at a 90 really makes the assembly process so much easier. Okay, now what we're going to do here is I've got this little 1/2x1/2 wire. You can pick it up at any of your box stores, hardware stores. I'll go ahead and mark it out to 9x9, and so this is going to fit inside of the box area. And now, I've got these little shears, and it makes cutting that just super quick and super easy. But I've cut this many times with just a pair of diagonal snips and diagonal cutters. This wire cuts super easy. So on the one edge where this is a piece of wire I've used before, I always, when I cut, I try to cut next to the square box so that I don't have these little sharp pieces sticking out. And so that leaves the little sharp points on your scrap, which this was. And now that fancy shear, it just doesn't cut those little bitty pieces off that good. So I just come back with a pair of diagonal cutters and clipped off on the far end the extra little tabs. And as you see, it's just a little bit slower, but it still is not that slow. I'm actually cutting like 2 at a time with the diagonal cutters, and it comes out fine. So now that I cut this to my 9 inches, I went ahead and measured over and figured out where the 9-inch square, so this stuff's about 20 inches wide, so I can make 2 of them out of each of these 9-inch strips. And so once again here, I just take my little shear, and I don't know, it's maybe overkill, but I've got it. I bought it for something else, and since it's there, I might as well use it, right? So now that we have our little 9x9 square, it's time to attach it to our little face there. So what I like to do here is, when I'm attaching this to my face, is I want to line up the squares, so that it's, when you're looking at it, once it's done, you shouldn't see this wire at all. But it looks professional if you have it going straight with the frame. And now these are just regular T50 staples. I've done this with a hand stapler before. Again, this being cedar, it's super soft. These regular T50 staples will go right in with a hand stapler. I've had a electric one that is well over 25 years old. I've done this little battery thing. I mean, it works fantastic. Drives them in, completely every time. And so these are about 1/2-inch T50 staples. And, I don't staple every wire, but I go through and I put 4 or 5 around each side, and just make sure it's, holds that wire nice and flat. So, if you got any little bends, once you staple it down, it gets nice and smooth. So here's where I screwed up. So after I put in the wire, I decided to go through and sand the face, getting ready to glue these boxes together. Well, should have sanded the faces before I put the wire in, so I did that on all the other ones. So, because with the wire on it, then it wanted to slide all over the table, scratching the table all up. But, it's just a project, every time you do it, I always mess something up. It's not that you never mess up, it's, do you correct it for the next time? So, no big deal, just made it a little bit harder to sand. Okay, so now that we have all the parts basically built, it's just a matter of gluing the frames with the wire over the boxes. So we went ahead and filled the boxes about 75–80% full of dirt. It just makes it a little bit easier. You can fill these completely full of dirt after they're built. you know, it'll go right through the little screen. You can just kind of put a pile of it on there, shake it, and it'll fall through the little cracks. Maybe, you know, run your hand back and forth on it a little bit. And my wife's had to fill other ones full of dirt after they were completed. But this time we just went ahead and put in a lot of the dirt before I glued it together. You can make these where the front's open, but it's really just a lot of work for nothing, because once these are in, you'll never have to take them back apart. So I just took a little combination square here, made sure that once I set it on, that it was the same distance on the top and bottom, you know, that the frame was square to the little box. You know, if it's off a hair, it ain't gonna make a big difference, but you know, the closer you get to perfect, the better it is on anything you do. So once I got that straight, we just took and threw a couple of clamps on it and let it set again for about an hour or so. And that way we made sure that, you know, it would be solid and wouldn't come off. So with that, the project's done. All you have to do now is add your little succulents in there. These are some of the ones that we did this weekend, and then I got some pictures of some that my wife has already placed in the plants. What she normally does is take a pair of chopsticks, and when you pull the succulents out, you can just shove the little roots right in between those wires, and then fill it full of, you know, dirt all the way up. And then she likes to use the living moss to put around it. And by putting that around it, it makes it look really nice. And then she just uses the chopsticks to shove them in.